let's go ahead and start. If I will ask you to please mute your lines and right now, except for Robert. And my name is Ellen Hahn, and I'm a professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Kentucky, and I direct the University of Kentucky Center for Appalachian Research in Environmental Sciences. And I am so thrilled that Robert has agreed to give the environmental health seminar for this month. And I am more than thrilled to welcome both the Center of Appalachian Regional ERC and the Appalachian Citizens Law Center as co-sponsors for this talk today, this seminar today. And I know we have a lot of people on this call who registered who are typically not on our environmental health seminar. So Bob, you're a big draw today. So I just want to ask you to, again, please just mute your lines, and then we will take questions at the end through the chat. So I am going to introduce Robert right now, and Bob, I guess. For those of you that don't know Bob, he's a clinical professor and director of the Mining Education and Research Center at the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's the PI for the only U.S. government-funded Black Lung Data and Research Center and for research projects on coal miners' health in the United States. Bob is a B reader and board certified physician for the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health. And he's also in internal medicine, pulmonary medicine, and critical care medicine. And he told us yesterday that he's a consultant contractor with US CDC and NIOSH. And so he goes a lot to West Virginia, knows many of you on the call. And we are just so pleased to welcome you. So I'll turn it over to Bob right now. And if you would like to type questions for Bob while he's presenting, feel free to type them in the chat.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's just a pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to talk to everybody. I just wish I could be with you in person, but hopefully at the end of this pandemic, I'll get the opportunity to do that. So that would be a really wonderful thing. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of silica in coal mine dust lung disease, because we think that it's been a huge actor in the resurgence of coal mine dust lung disease and very severe lung disease, the very severe stages of pneumoconiosis that we've been seeing in miners in Central Appalachia and in this country. So I thought I would talk about some of the evidence for that. These are my disclosures. I don't think that I have any conflicts or that my opinions are influenced by that, but just so you know who I work for. So we'll talk about the role of silica in the development of resurgent black lung. I'll talk a little bit about some X-ray evidence and some pathology evidence. And more recently, we've been actually delving into the mineralogy of this disease to try to understand what's been happening and why we're seeing so many miners with this very severe disease. And at the end, there's been some efforts through the US Congress, through the Mine Safety Health Administration to try to change the rules that we have for dust controls. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'm not sure where that's going, but I think that's an important thing that we need to make an effort to do in order to prevent this disease. So just very briefly, I wanted to talk about respirable crystalline silica, which is really the dust that we're talking about. Small respirable particles less than 5 microns in diameter that are inhaled. They're usually freshly fractured dust taken from rock and other drilling, blasting, cutting rock. So silica is a nasty dust. It's really very highly toxic. It directly injures the cell, causing direct cytotoxicity. And it induces the production of what we call reactive oxygen species, which are chemical species that are really cause a lot of damage directly to other cells, as well as reactive nitrogen species. It stimulates the cells in the lungs, the scavenger cells, macrophages, to release inflammatory and profibrotic mediators, TNF-alpha, interleukin-1 beta, TGF-beta, and others that are really mediators that call more inflammatory cells and induce the lung to develop scar tissue. the lung remodels, and you get collagen and elastin deposition, and ultimately you get the death of normal cells. So where do we get silica in underground coal mining? We think of coal miners as being exposed to coal dust. And really now we talk about the diseases of coal miners as coal mine dust lung disease, CMDLD, not just coal workers pneumoconiosis, because it's a broad spectrum of disease caused by the dusts and other toxicants in the coal mine atmosphere. So you should be able to see here my pointer showing that in many of our mines, we are taking rock that's above and below the coal seam. And I want to thank my colleagues at NIOSH for, I stole this slide from them. This is a really nice picture of the coal seam, which is here, and then rock that's above it. And you can also get rock that's below it to the floor. And it's been very easy with modern, powerful, highly energized cutting machines that are used in modern day coal mines just to cut through this rock like it's butter. Or as they say in New York, like butter, and take the coal and rock and have it separated profitably by modern coal mine preparation plants. In the old days, they'd be very careful because the machines weren't so strong and powerful to mainly focus on just getting the coal out and less rock and less pulverized rock, which would mean less silica. This is a picture that demonstrates one of the other issues that we see in modern mining, which is narrow seam mining. People taking coal from very thin seams, which also means that they take a fair amount of rock that's above and below the seam as well. And so this is narrow seam mining, another way that people are getting exposed to coal mine dust. And here is an example of some of the jobs in coal mining which are responsible for very high silica exposures. And one of those is called roof bolting. This gentleman working, this is a picture I took in Jacksboro, Tennessee, of a mine that's fairly low, maybe about 4.5 feet high. And he's drilling holes into the rock top of the mine and inserting these roof bolts. You can see a roof bolt down here that he's getting ready to insert along with a big tube of glue, and they glue the strata of rock together to prevent the roof from falling in. In the old days in mining, they would just timber the mines by putting wood, large wood kind of poles or tree looking things that would then with a wedge on top keep the mine from falling in. But this roof bolting means that you're drilling into the hard rock top and then there's a plume of silica dust that falls down. And people also would drill into the sides or the ribs of the mine tunnels in many cases where those were not stable to secure those as well. This gentleman is changing the bits on a continuous miner head, and these are used to mine coal, but nowadays they're often used to cut tunnels and mine development. And some of the mines where we've seen these horrible outbreaks of pneumoconiosis have been where these type of continuous miners are used to cut slopes or tunnels through rock and very high quartz in rock, which causes a lot of exposure to silica, this kind of a continuous miner drum. This is a long wall shear, and I'll show you this machine is cutting through the coal. You can see the rock on the top here, and then the coal seam. You get water sprays trying to control the dust. So you can see there's some dust controls in effect with very high flow of water that's supposed to knock the dust down. You can also see that the direction of flow is downwind, it's blown down, and that's also an attempt to kind of keep the dust out of the face of the miners. But you'll notice here the very large amount of rock above the coal seam that this very powerful long wall shear head is cutting. And then just so you don't think that it's underground coal miners only that are at risk for this, surface miners are also at risk for getting a lot of silica exposure. This is a mine that's out west in Wyoming, and you can see huge drag lines that are removing overburden from the coal seam, and that's drilling through rock, cutting through rock, and they're exposed to a lot of freshly fractured silica. These pictures come from Dr. Kara Halden's paper on progressive massive fibrosis in surface coal miners, and you can see these are surface drills that are drilling through the overburden that it will then be blasted and then removed by the drag line that you saw before. And you can see these miners standing in absolute clouds of freshly fractured dust that's emanating from these drills. And these surface coal miners certainly are subject to coal mine dust lung disease, and we've had some severe cases of progressive massive fibrosis, the very advanced stage of disease from people that are working these surface jobs. So those are the exposures. Let's talk a little bit about the epidemiology of this disease and what we've been seeing that's really raised the alarm that we're having newer severe exposures that are causing resurgent disease, severe disease. Well, the first types of data come from the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program that's operated by NIOSH, the Respiratory Health Division Surveillance Branch down in Morgantown, West Virginia. And the purpose of this program is to do medical surveillance on active miners, including chest x-rays and recently spirometry and some respiratory symptoms. And the main purpose of this program was to detect early disease by finding early changes on chest x-ray and removing anybody that has a chest x-ray that's positive from exposure, or at least mitigating exposure by putting them in a low dust area. But importantly, these surveillance programs also identify the failure of primary prevention, our failure to control dust and prevent disease developing in the population. So we were pretty happy. The modern dust control regulations were passed and the Mine Safety Health Administration created in 1970. So from 1970 all the way through the end of the 20th century, when we look at the data from active miners that are participating in the NIOSH Coal Workers X-ray surveillance program, we can see this very nice decline by tenure of the rates of people that have pneumoconiosis. That's anybody that has a positive X-ray on the surveillance X-rays. And so it went down from 1 in 5 for the highest tenured workers. And then as you had less tenure, of course, there were lower disease. And so we thought that by the end of the 20th century, things were going pretty well, and we're doing a great job in controlling exposure and eliminating this disease. But then early in the 21st century, in 2005, this article was published using data from the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program and looking at people that had more than one chest X-ray in this in the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program to see whose X-rays were getting worse rapidly. And by getting worse, we mean that they were deteriorating by more than one ILO subcategory within a 5-year period, or if they developed PMF, even though they've been working after 1970, after the institution of, or 1985, excuse me, after the institution of modern dust controls. And you can see that these are the areas where the rates of people in the program that had rapidly progressive disease were getting to be high. And so this area here is southwestern Virginia, southern West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. And these are the hotspots for rapidly progressive disease. And this made us think that something is going on that's not right, and we're not necessarily accomplishing things. The Illinois basin, where we see a lot of our miners, wasn't particularly affected. This is Alabama. There were some areas in the southern Appalachian Mountain chain that were affected, and then this is out west, where there were some areas of rapidly progressive disease also. And then this is more recent data that was done 2006 and 2007, again showing these hotspots were still having large numbers of active miners that had more than one X-ray, and the X-rays were progressing somewhat rapidly. And you can see that compared to the rest of the country, Illinois and out west, that the hotspots of Virginia, Kentucky, and West Virginia were still quite prevalent in comparison. So data from the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program is updated every time there's a survey and people go out with a mobile van, as well as people participating in their local chest X-ray surveillance. And you can see that the data for 10 years was really declining quite nicely through the year 2000. But then this is what we saw after the turn of the century, that we have a resurgence of a disease that we thought we were eliminating, and in fact, we're not eliminating. And so this first signal came in that we saw this in the beginning, maybe starting 10 years ago. We started to see increases in the rates of tenure, people with different tenures having increases in their rate of pneumoconiosis. So this resulted in, under the Obama administration, under the leadership of the Assistant Secretary for Mine Safety and Health, Joe Main, MSHA developing new rules and a program to end black lung. And actually, that respirable dust rule was passed in 2014. because of this resurgent disease that we were not doing enough to control dust. And this rule had lowered the levels for coal mine dust from 2 milligrams to 1.5, although it didn't necessarily address silica in as strong a way as we would hope. So we'll talk about that also. Then in 2014, after that rule was passed, data from the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program, just looking at the central Appalachian states of Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, showed this very alarming curve where the rate of PMF, which had decreased dramatically by the end of the 20th century, was resurging dramatically, even in miners that were still working and participating in the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program. So this was a very, very concerning curve. And this was published by David Blackley and colleagues at NIOSH in 2014. Our dear colleague Brandon Crum, who's on the call today, reported from his clinic, his single clinic in Kentucky, that there was in his clinic alone, they saw a resurgence of huge numbers of people with PMFs just for one clinic. And this was published in the MMWR back in 2016, where he initially, and he's found many more since then, 60 patients with PMF, which is really something that is outrageous to see that. This very, very large numbers of miners who are actually quite young. Then following up on that, we saw from another one of our clinics in southwestern Virginia, Stone Mountain clinics, that there were 416 coal miners with PMF from their 3 clinics that were seen between 2013 and 2017. These numbers are astounding and incredibly concerning. And so these case series of PMF cases just from a radiology clinic that was doing black lung evaluations, and from black lung clinics that were seeing miners to help them get evaluated for their benefits was really of great concern. So the question then was, are we seeing these massive resurgence of PMF cases just in these few clinics, or what's happening nationally? So our group, along with our colleagues at NIOSH, and Kirsten Omberg is the senior, as the first author on this, looked at the data from the US Department of Labor's Black Lung Claims Program, the Federal Black Lung Benefits Program, to see if there was a change in the number of people applying for black lung benefits who had PMF. And this is national data, and it's a data set that up until this time, this is 2018, really hadn't been utilized for public health purposes in any significant way. So these are these are hundreds of thousands of claims that were evaluated from using data from 1970, the inception of the program, through 2016. And we found that the percent of PMF claims increased, and that increase was accelerating since 1996. And this is not what you want to be seeing if you have a public health program that's to prevent a very serious disease. And these numbers of cases were 10 times more than the number that were identified in the surveillance program of active miners, which means that this program, which is really geared at former miners, people that have finished their mining career and are then applying for black lung benefits, that they were not captured while they were working. And that our voluntary program of surveillance was really just seeing the tip of the iceberg of this resurgence of progressive massive fibrosis. And what was interesting is that this increase in PMF occurred even as the workforce declined, and the rate of claims of that workforce was stable. And again, interestingly, the former miners' PMF paralleled what was happening in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, so that the center of the greatest amount of disease was similar to what was seen in the active miners in the surveillance program. And this graph shows you the total numbers of claimants, and you can see this huge peak that happened when there was a change in the rules, when it went from the Social Security Administration and the rules relaxed a little bit. But the percent of claims has been increasing, the percent of claims that is with PMF. And so that is something, again, that we really do not want to be seeing, that we're seeing a higher percentage of people applying that have the most severe disease. And this just shows you in orange the area where the percent of claims for PMF was the highest, and it parallels the pictures that you saw of the hotspots. So what is causing this really very severe resurgence of this advanced form of coal workers' pneumoconiosis? And we think that silica is an important driving force, not the only force, but an important source. And we'll talk about the radiographic evidence next. One of the things that was first kind of an indicator of this was the pattern of findings on chest x-rays of coal miners in the coal workers health surveillance program, and that there was an increase in R-type opacities. When we look at x-rays for coal workers pneumoconiosis, we look at the scars in the lungs, and we have found over the years that there's an association between round scars that have a diameter between 3 and 10 millimeters with silica exposure. And we found that our colleagues at NIOSH found that there was an increasing rate of people from the states of Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia of having this type of opacity compared to the rest of the country, that there was an increase in the percentage of R-type opacities. Other types, P or Q opacities, are round opacities with smaller diameters. But this large diameter round lesion is very characteristic of silica. And so we felt that this emerging pattern of severe disease, lung disease among US coal miners means that there's a problem with silica control and that we have to address our efforts to silica control. And this was a really important thing. And then that same study methodology was repeated in 2018 to see if this was still occurring. And Noemi Hall and colleagues from the surveillance branch at NIOSH re-looked at the data, updating it with newer information, and found that there was a 6 times increase in the rate of R-type opacities among underground miners in Central Appalachia compared to the rest of the country, excluding Central Appalachia. So that is another piece of evidence that silica was playing a role. So that was one of the first things that made us think that we really need to be looking at silica. The next type of evidence that we saw is looking at pathology of the lung of miners where we had available lung tissue to see if silica might be playing a role there. And one of the sources of information that was very important but really hadn't been looked at in this regard was the National Coal Workers Autopsy Study, NCWAS, that NIOSH operated from 1971 through 2012. And it was originally operated by NIOSH to give miners' families the opportunity to get evidence to support their black lung claims. They could submit the lungs of the miners who'd passed away to the program, and a NIOSH pathologist would evaluate it and classify it, and that could be used to help the miners. Over the years, the program became, there were fewer and fewer cases accessioned, but no one had really looked at the cases to look at the PMF in those lungs and classify it to see what type of PMF, what type of progressive massive fibrosis was present. And so what we did is we got expert occupational pulmonary pathologists to look at the tissue in collaboration with the Health Effects Laboratory Division in Morgantown, led by Dr. Ann Hubbs and Marlene O'Randall, to pull all the cases that had PMF, to look at those slides and classify them as to whether or not they were mainly coal type, where the coal dust was predominant, mixed, or silicotic type. And so we had found, and then we looked at it over historical periods to see if the pattern of disease had changed. And we found 376 cases that had material available to use. So here's a few photomicrographs of slides of autopsy material from coal miners that had their tissues evaluated in the National Coal Workers Autopsy Study. And you can see this is, when we look at this, there's a lot of black pigment here. And this is what we would call classic coal type of PMF. So what you would see in a coal miner from decades ago, the type of large scar that would be causing PMF from what we would have considered regular coal mining operations. This is a mixed type where you still see some black pigment, but you see a lot of these pink scarred whorled nodules. So there's a lot more scar tissue that doesn't have pigment that's really apparent to the eye. And we consider this a mixed dust type of PMF, where there was more than 25% silica, but less than 75% silicotic type nodules. So this was a mixed type of dust. And then this is a coal miner, but there's very, very little pigment. And what you're seeing here is mainly the pink whorled silicotic nodules, which are present in more than 75% of the area of that PMF lesion. And that we consider to be silicotic type of PMF, where the dust that was causing the scar, the huge progressive massive fibrosis scar, was mainly silica. So we found, when we looked at the data from the National Coal Workers Autopsy Study, comparing people that mined before and after 1990, that there was no difference in mining tenure. The majority of miners came from Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. We didn't have as many from Kentucky participating, and I'm not exactly sure why that was, but this was where they, the states where people chose to participate in the program. It may have been a result of the different legal requirements for state compensation for pneumoconiosis. But what we found, interestingly, is that there was a significant increase in the proportion of silicotic type of PMF that occurred after 1990 in this program. So before 1990, the proportion of miners whose autopsied materials were valuable in the program was 24%, and that increased to 40% of cases from 1990 to 2012. And this just shows some of that data. The numbers of participants were fewer as time went on because the program became less popular. And also the ability to get pathologists to work in the program was harder, given the little bit of money that was allocated to them for them to do these autopsies. But you can see that coal type, which is the gray bar, was really predominant in the decades of the 1970s, still predominant in the 1980s, but by the 1990s, silica type was increasing in proportion compared to the other mixed and coal type. And then by the 21st century, you can see that the silicotic type, even though there were fewer cases, was much more predominant. And this is just showing just a different way of graphing that, just showing the increase in a proportion of silicotic type of PMF over time. So this was some evidence from bright field microscopy. So you just take the lung, you do a standard hematoxin eosin stain, and you look and see what amount of the scar tissue was coal type, pigmented with much coal, intermediate, which is mixed type, or a silicotic type. We also published a case series of modern cases. So this is from people that were not participating in the National Coal Workers Autopsy Study, but people who died, and we had access to a case series of pathology from people with rapidly progressive pneumoconiosis in the modern time. So not looking at the older archival materials from the NIOSH program, but modern materials. And this is an explant of a lung from a coal miner with PMF. And you can see this massive progressive massive fibrosis lesion in the top of the lung. And it looks quite pigmented. It looks like coal would be a significant part of this. But when you actually look at the slices of lung tissue, as you can see, it's really this pink whorled fibrotic silicotic type of material. And a high power view shows what we call a classic silica pearl, a nodule of whorled collagen fibers and lots of inflammatory cells. One of the things that we've noticed in these case series of pathology is that is a lot of inflammation. It's a very active inflammatory process in this rapidly progressive pneumoconiosis. Here's a higher power view showing some pigmented black dust. So you would think, okay, if you're just a pathologist looking at the bright field microscopy, you would see this brown and black pigmented material. But when you look at it under polarizing light microscopy, you're looking for birefringent particles. And you can see this beautiful starry night, although not very beautiful for the miner. These elongated, brightly birefringent particles are silicates. And then the little bit duller, rounder, less birefringent particles are silica. And you can see that this lung is just chock full of mineral particulate, so that the dust that they inhaled was really very, very full of this mineral material. So we're in the process of another pathology study to compare the pathology of modern miners with progressive massive fibrosis and rapidly progressive pneumoconiosis to these historical cases, looking at bright field polarizing light microscopy together, as well as looking at the mineralogy. And I can show you some preliminary data on the study. The study is now in its just the beginning of its third year of acquiring materials, pathologic materials, and we've been a bit hampered by the pandemic. But this will tell you a little bit about it. This is our group that involves a large group of pathologists from Calgary, Canada, from South Africa, upstate New York, and from the University of Colorado. And we're collaborating with the USGS in Denver to look at materials and the mineralogy, as well as mining engineering folks. So I'll just show you an example of one of the cases. This is a miner. We got their lung material from the hospital where they had a biopsy. And you can see the lung tissue. I'll just show you a slide that's a blow up of this one tiny area of the lung. It looks like it's black and darkly pigmented, but under microscopy, you can see that it really is all silica. These are these just completely, the lung is completely replaced with this fibrotic whorled silicotic nodules. And so this is, again, what we're seeing in coal miners, and my colleagues who are pathologists who've been doing this for decades said that they are just not used to seeing this in coal miners. This is something that they might see in sandblasters or other workers that are exposed to very high levels of silica. And here's a nice inset of a normal lung with nice normal air spaces. And you can see that that lung is really completely destroyed and replaced with these silicotic nodules. And a higher power view shows another interesting finding that we've seen in these cases, and that's areas of pulmonary alveolar proteinosis, where we get lipoproteins exuded into air spaces, which is another characteristic of a very intense exposure to silica. It's not something that we see with coworkers' pneumoconiosis. So we've been seeing in these modern cases of rapidly progressive disease, very high, a higher incidence of people that have areas of pulmonary alveolar proteinosis, or what we really should call silica proteinosis. Again, another sign that silica is important. Here's again what a normal air sac should look like, a nice thin walled area. And when we place it under polarizing light microscopy, we can see again the birefringent crystals and mineral that's present in this lung, which you normally would not see in large quantities in a coal miner. So currently we've got 30 modern cases, which we've gotten from treating physicians, black lung clinics, miners, advocates who've sent us and referred these patients to us. And the cases are either autopsy, explant, because unfortunately, many of these miners are so ill that they go to lung transplantation. And some have gone to lung biopsies because these nodules or lesions in their lungs are concerning for lung cancer, and people will biopsy them to make sure that there's not an associated cancer. So once we've got those tissues, I've shown you the pathologic evidence in terms of the bright field microscopy. We've been doing some mineralogic analysis on these tissues also to see if we can understand the mineral particulate that's associated with this rapidly progressive disease. So we've taken this surgically or pathologically obtained tissue, and then we're putting it on carbon planchettes, and then counting up particles using scanning electron microscopy. And then we actually identify the particles using energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, or EDX or EDS, to actually identify the mineral particulate. And so here's a report of some of the first modern cases compared to 10 of the cases from the NIOSH coworkers autopsy study. And here's the electron micrograph of, you can see the silica nodule. It doesn't look as beautiful as it does under the bright, colorful H&E stain, but you can see that. But when we do use scanning electron microscopy, we can actually see these macrophages are filled with mineral particulate. And then all we have to do is shine the X-ray beam on each of these particles, and we can see that this one is an aluminum silicate in this one area. And then you can see that there's silicon spikes when we shine the particulate on other areas. So if we look at this first particles, these are silicates. This particle here in frame D, when we look at the spike, it's a silicon spike. So we can say for sure exactly what type of particle it is. And we can identify heavy metals. We can identify the mineral particulate as well. And here's another example of dust-laden macrophages full of this mineral particulate. The macrophages are trying to engulf it and trying to digest it and eliminate it, but obviously cannot. And this little plus sign marks the particle that we're looking at with the energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. And you can see it's a silica particle. The silicon peak is quite prominent here. And this is just another view of titanium, silica, silicates. each particle can be identified, and we're trying to see if there's a difference in the type and character of the particles, the size of the particles in the modern cases of coworkers pneumoconiosis that's rapidly progressive compared to the historical cases. So here's some preliminary data that we have on the mineralogy from the historic and modern cases. You can see that there's a significant difference in the total silica, the silica concentration between the historic and modern cases. And then when we look at the percent silica, the number of particles by percentage, that there's a significant increase in the modern cases of particulate silica. So prior to this, we had the pathologic pattern of the silica nodules, what looked like silica, but now we actually have identified the particle type itself and have shown in these early case series, and we're ongoing with this data, we'll be analyzing the more recent data, that this, this percent of particles is silica and it is increasing. So we have radiographic evidence by the R-type opacities, we have pathologic evidence by the type of PMF, and we have polarizing light microscopy showing lots of particulate, and then the mineralogic analysis, which is in progress, is showing an increase in the percent and concentration of silica. So what is, let's talk about the dust data for what we know about the dust exposures of modern miners. So, and then I'll finish up shortly, and then we hopefully will have some time for some questions. So the US permissible exposure limit for coal mine dust, as I mentioned in 2014 at the end of the Obama administration, was reduced to 1.5 milligrams per meter cubed for total respirable dust. And prior to 2014, it was 2 milligrams per meter cubed, which seemed to be working through the end of the 20th century, but clearly something was going wrong. For respirable crystalline silica, it used to be in MSHA about a 0.1 milligram per meter cubed or 100 micrograms. And 2014 to present, if you average it using the formula that MSHA has, it was reduced to about 0.075. OSHA in 2016, for the first time in 40 years, actually lowered the permissible exposure limit to silica for non-mining jobs to 50 micrograms or 0.05 milligrams. So that was just lowered. But the question that we have is the monitoring and enforcement and evaluation of silica exposures in the mines, is it really enough? This comes from Dr. Doney, who's an investigator with the Respiratory Health Division down at Morgantown, West Virginia, showing that the geometric concentration for silica, for respirable coal mine dust, excuse me, is really going down quite nicely, and looks like everything was okay. And if we look at those, the rest of the U.S. compared to Appalachia, but if we look at the percent of silica is higher in Appalachia than the rest of the country, so that may be part of the problem. And then if we look at the percent of quartz in samples over time, we can see that there's, even though they seem to be relatively meeting the permissible exposure limits, that it's still, the percent of quartz is higher in Appalachian mines. So the dust data, well, it seems to be showing that everything is compliant, and that may be the result of how the sampling is done, whether mining activities are changed or not during mining. But what's a little bit harder to fiddle with, if people wanted to fiddle with it, would be the percent of the dust that's silica. And we can see that the mines in central Appalachia or in Appalachia have higher percent silica in their compliance sampling dust data. So we think that what's changed over time in history? Why has this happened, and what needs to be done about it? So as we talked about earlier, it's possible that with modern mining equipment, that we're mining thinner seams, and we're able to take a lot of rock with it, so that we have much more powerful mechanized mining equipment. We're taking more rock. We're also having our miners are working longer hours, more days per week. And then really there's a question of how well the mine operations are adhering to regulations and controlling the dust exposures that their miners are faced with. So we think that changes in exposures that have happened over time, that there's more silica. There's probably other exposures that we haven't really fully evaluated, silicates and other heavy metals or metals that may be in the geology of the mines, and we have to think about that. But one of the other intriguing thoughts that we're trying to evaluate with our current mineralogic study is, has modern, highly energized, powerful mining equipment changed particle characteristics? If you're drilling a hole and putting in some dynamite and blasting, you may get large particles and not a lot of incredibly fine dust. But with these highly energized cutting heads and machines, it's possible that we're getting smaller sizes, which means that the surface areas are exponentially increased, and therefore potentially much more toxic. And if the shape has also changed. So that is something that we are evaluating in our mineralogic study with the scanning electron microscopy, as well as with mine samples that our colleagues at Virginia Tech, the School of Mining Engineering, are also doing, as they are doing dust samples in active mines to see what the characteristics of the dust are. Unfortunately, we do not have archival specimens of dust taken from the mines from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Nobody seems to have kept that kind of material, because it would be very interesting to compare the dust particulate in the lungs of miners, which we have from the autopsy data and from the modern data. But it would be very interesting to compare the actual dust samples from mining operations then to mining operations now. So some final thoughts about the role of silica in rapidly progressive pneumoconiosis and this outbreak of progressive massive fibrosis, the very severe disease, is that pathology and mineralogic findings from the autopsy program and recent cases indicate that silica from rock material is implicated. As I mentioned, we're looking at the particle size to see if there's any difference in the particle size of the lungs from miners that we have autopsy material from the 70s, 80s, and 90s is different than the particle sizes in people's lungs from today. And I think I mentioned this already. So it seems that there's been a lot of pressure as a result of this outbreak and all of the science that has shown aggressive, severe disease in young miners, that MSHA should have a dust control rule that specifically addresses silica. The current rule only addresses total respirable dust and silica as a fraction of that dust. But we think that we should be measuring silica more frequently and have a more strict dust control. So as you can see from here, there was a request for information to determine whether MSHA should have a proposed rule about respirable silica. We had a response that we worked on from the American Thoracic Society and the Black Lung Clinics submitted, but we wanted to make sure that the rule did not rely only on personal protective equipment, because there were some efforts to say that the way to deal with this problem is just to make sure that miners wore respirators. But we know clearly that that's really the last reasonable form of protective equipment, that engineering controls are much more important. We cannot rely only on respirators. We think that there should be a specific permissible exposure limit for silica, and it should at least be equal to the OSHA limit. There should be no reason that miners should be allowed to be exposed to more silica, respirable silica, than any other occupation that's not mining, because silica is silica, whether you get it from a mine or whether it's from a construction site. And we think that there should be aggressive and frequent sampling for silica. Right now, silica is only sampled by a personal dust sampler. The filter is then sent to an MSHA laboratory in Pittsburgh, for example, and it takes a long time to get that data back. But there are technologies that are being developed that will provide an in-mine silica analyzer, so you can take a sample and analyze it right at the end of that shift, and that they should be also personal quartz monitors developed. And then one of the kind of loopholes that I think is quite large is that the sampling that occurs under the current rule is really just during mining activities, when you're actually mining coal. But it doesn't really require that the mine sample during mine development and construction, which are very high risk. So if you're digging a tunnel, you're not mining coal, so that the dust that the miner is exposed to then really isn't sampled and evaluated very carefully. And so we think that mine development, the digging of tunnels, the sinking of shafts, and high-risk occupations like longwall shear operators and continuous miner operators and roof bolters and rib bolters should be sampled, and that medical surveillance should be increased to every 2 to 3 years as opposed to every 5 years. So in summary, I've talked about the resurgent epidemic, the epidemic which includes rapidly progressive disease and progressive massive fibrosis, and that it's been centered in Kentucky, that's Eastern Kentucky, Southern West Virginia, Southwestern Virginia, and that there's evidence, both X-ray evidence and pathology evidence and mineralogy evidence to support the idea that silica is important. Interestingly, the dust data shows higher concentrations of silica in dust samples from Appalachia. And then finally, that there are efforts to change the rules to improve our monitoring for silica dust in coal mines. This effort, we've submitted these thoughts. I don't know where MSHA stands right now on changing any regulations, but it really would require a lot of pressure from health advocates, from clinics, from miners and miners advocates to get this through MSHA. So I will end there and then open up for any questions or comments. So I will maybe stop sharing the screen and then see if what thoughts people may have.
Thank you, Bob. That was amazing. We appreciate your expertise and your passion for this issue. It's obviously a really tough nut to crack. And we do have some questions in the chat. I do want to tell the group that before you get off the call, we do have a quick, very brief survey just to assess kind of what you thought of the talk. And that would be great if you could fill that out. It's in the chat box. So let me, if it's okay with you, unless you want to do your own, the first question was actually Jamie Sturgill. Let's see here, hold on. If I can find it here.
I see it here. Do I have data on high wall mining?
High wall mining, right.
Right, so high wall mining usually refers to, it's a surface operation, but there's a big wall and then people will dig into that high wall. So it's kind of a mixture between surface and underground mining. They often have these continuous miners that go in remotely driven by the miners, but I don't have any, I'm not aware of any specific data, but I would imagine that to the extent that they're in plumes of dust, even though that it is a surface operation, that they would be at risk as well. I think that that's so that would certainly be a risk job. If they're going directly into coal, it would be less silica. But when you're creating that high wall, getting through the overburden, getting down, that would be very similar to to other operations. There was a question right after that to me privately, just talking about rock dust. So rock dust is a carbonate, crushed limestone or other marble, crushed marble that's very low in silica. It's used to spray on the walls and the face to reduce float coal dust, which is an explosive risk. So carbonates are probably less toxic, and yes, they still use it, but it's not silica. Although I have heard of some roof bolters taking the silica dust from their roof bolting and putting that on the wall. It is inert, but that would be very, very dangerous. So that's that question.
The next one I see says, has any work been done to understand selection and to participation into the CHSSP? And tell us what that is again, the CW.
Yeah, so the CWHSP is the Coworkers Health Surveillance Program. That is the health surveillance operated by the Respiratory Health Division of the Surveillance Branch of NIOSH in Morgantown. We actually have, our group with NIOSH has worked to overlap the Black Lung Benefits people that participated with the surveillance people, and we see some huge holes. And I think that, and NIOSH actually has been working very, very hard to increase participation. They had a request for information to try to see if people had some ideas. We know that in some areas of the country, miners fear participation for a couple of reasons. One is they don't want to find out if they have disease. These are jobs that are very well paying, that they can put their kids through college and take care of their families, and are a little bit afraid to find out if they have disease, and they would have to face losing their jobs. But also some mine operators are very hostile to participation in the surveillance program, and there are some miners that fear retribution if they participate. I think that there's some fears in that regard. There's some fears of people not being protected if they find they have disease, and then it's unfortunate, but the Black Lung Benefits Program process is adversarial. It's long, it's drawn out. So if you find out you have an illness and you can't work, by the time you get benefits, it may be, in some cases, it could take years, even a decade. So that's something that NIOSH is working hard to fix, but unless miners feel very protected and safe and they can get compensated fairly and quickly, I think we're going to have trouble getting them to participate because it is a voluntary program. And the miners union is against it becoming mandatory for those reasons, that it's of fears of retribution and not being protected.
The next question I see, thanks Bob, has to do with comparing exposure to silica from sand mining, the northern white sand used for fracking, and has any work been done to understand the difference in silica type and exposure across these two industries, I guess coal mining and fracking?
Right, that's a great question. I think that the mining of the sand is very high exposure. Then the processed sand is put in these tankers and taken to the fracking sites and mixed with chemicals and injected into the fractured strata of the earth for fracking. I'd have to look and see if there's been any difference. I would expect it just depends on the geology. I know there's a lot of fracking sand that's being mined in northern Illinois and in Wisconsin and other states, but I think that's a great question. And I would have to research it and see if there's been any specific mineralogic evaluation. Certainly, I'll check with my colleagues at the USGS. They may have some thoughts on that.
I'd encourage you. We still have a few minutes, so I'd encourage you to put any questions you have in the chat. I have a question though, and it relates to co-exposures and environmental health. And so I do a lot of work with radon. And I know that in some parts of the country, there have been high levels of pulmonary fibrosis among people who've had long-term radon exposure. And so I just wondered if you or your colleagues have looked at co-exposures in this population. So people like coal miners who've also, are obviously exposed to silica and other chemicals, but also radon, just the whole idea of co-exposures.
Right, so we've thought about that a lot in terms of lung cancer in the coal mining population, looking at what are the carcinogens that coal miners are exposed to, which includes silica, which is an IR class 1 human carcinogen. There's some data that we've published that coal dust itself may actually be a carcinogen, but not enough to change its classification. Diesel exhaust particulate is present in many underground mines used on equipment that's man trips and other equipment. So the diesel is a carcinogen as well. And radon is also possible, but I'm not aware of any large data sets that allow us to calculate radon exposures in coal mining, in coal mines in the US. So I don't know about that, but it's certainly, we always talk about radon as being another confounder for lung cancer. We've looked to see how we could adjust for that in our studies of cancer epidemiology in coal miners, but haven't found good data sets on that. And it's not mandatory, and I don't know that coal mine operators would be motivated to look for that.
Well, this could be a point of collaboration because with KGS, we have a large data set in Kentucky on radon values. So we might chat. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Bill Hanneberg is the state geologist, and his question or comment was I can't even say it.
Mineralogically,
frac sand should almost be purely quartz for geomechanical reasons, is what he says.
Right. So what we see in coal mine dust, we see quartz, but it's not going to be pure quartz. Whereas clearly for fracking, you want that it's a much purer thing. So I would just say the main difference would likely be a higher percentage of pure quartz, which is more toxic. But we've seen in some areas of coal mine construction where people have mined through very, very high quartz rock to get down to the coal seams. And as you all may remember, the Gauley Bridge Hawks Nest disaster, where they mined a tunnel for Union Carbide through a mountain that was almost pure quartz. So you can mine through mineralogically very high quartz, but it's not going to be as pure as fracking, I would be sure.
And then John Rosenberg says, is there any evidence that smoking affects these results?
Not really not the pathology or mineralogy that I know of. There's really I guess the only thing that might happen is smoking somehow might affect dust retention in the lungs, but the findings of the pathology and mineralogy would really not be affected by smoking. So I think that we wouldn't say at all that smoking has somehow made us erroneously think that silica was playing a role.
I see that Wayne would maybe like to ask a question.
Yeah, I kind of want to pose a question for discussion. I mean, I think this is a fabulous presentation. I mean, there's been a lot of great presentations, a lot of publications on this topic, but you did a great job of synthesizing where we're at with this problem that's been going on for 10, 15 years. And I think we're finally coming around to the messages. It's silica, and silica is a problem, and the coal standard, whether we change that or not, if we didn't address the silica standard, we're still going to have a problem. What is interesting about Kentucky, and it was Ellen's comment that really kind of sparked this on the radon question, which I'm not quite as jazzed about that being a potential cause of problems, but I think it's interesting. She's noted a great deal of variability in radon across the state. And what's interesting about Kentucky, and some of your slides showed it, in Western Kentucky, we don't see the same level of problem that we see in Eastern Kentucky. And so this brings in a Hannenberg question. The mineralogy must be very different. Also, we know that mining practices vary somewhat. That's more of a Joe Satil question. And then we also know that management practices differ across companies, and that there's very different styles of running companies in Eastern versus Western Kentucky. I just wondered if anybody wanted to speak on that, because I think we're a great experimental group that kind of talk about, hey, you see it really bad over here, not so bad here. How does the mineralogy and the way we mine and control dust really play into this? But thank you. That's a fabulous presentation.
Right. I think we'll get, I'll just say a few words now. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. Our colleagues at Virginia Tech's mining, the School of Mining Engineering, have taken samples from Central Appalachia, but also from the Illinois Midwestern Basin, which is very similar to the Western Kentucky Basin. And then they've gotten some samples from out west as well. So we're really trying to see what they see in terms of the dust size, shape, concentration, and concentrations of these different dusts. That'll be very interesting. And we're also trying to look not only across geography now at mining practices, but historically. So we're hoping that they're looking to see if how mining machinery has changed over historical time periods to see what's changed. But that's all I want to say right now. But.
Yeah. Before others jump in, I wanted to ask this question. You probably know, I started my career in 1978 in the respiratory disease lab in Morgantown. We were underground taking samples just about every day. Those samples no longer exist?
It's the holy grail for us. So Wayne, if you or anybody can find us some old dust samples to send to our colleagues to do this mineralogic analysis, we'd love it. We talked to
yeah, if we could find that you're exactly right. And I know where they were in the 70s and 80s. Somebody probably pitched them out. Yep.
Actually, at the beginning of this project, they were just about to throw out all the NIOSH, or a large part of this NIOSH autopsy archival stuff. We were, Dr. Hubbs and I went to a dumpster and pulled out boxes and boxes of slides that had been thrown out like that day before. So you have to be very careful because they do try to clean up stuff for some reason.
I'll just jump in here and say we have 1 minute left on this hour, and I just want to remind you to please take the survey before you get off. The link should be in your chat box. And if there's any burning desire, any question or comment, I'd love to hear it.
And people can feel free to email me, bobcohen@uic.edu. Be happy to respond that way.
Bill did put something, Bill Hannenberg, the state geologist, put something in the chat about the coal bed thickness, that it'll differ between Eastern and Western Kentucky, and the dust particle size and shape are also interesting, but that might be a combination of geology and mining technology. So let's see if there's anything else here. Satil said, generally Eastern Kentucky has thinner seams, so there has likely been a tendency to cut roof rock for clearance. And yeah, So we're kind of out of time, but there's one more comment here, though, to answer Mr. I guess Wayne's question. I've been doing research understanding participation in the CWHSP across, and I'm also speaking with coal miners directly. I'm still trying to consolidate my findings, but I'm pursuing characteristics of small mine size, sulfur content, much to talk about, and happy to talk about it. So, man, we've had a lot of great conversation, and I want to thank everyone, and particularly Bob. This was a fabulous seminar. I want to thank my colleagues at the Appalachian Citizens Law Center and NIOSH and Central Appalachian ERC. I think it's been a great collaboration, and I would love to see us have some collaborations come out of this talk. So thank you so much to everyone. And we are posting Dr. Cohen's talk on our website, so you can see it there. And yeah, thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.